Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Fallout, exposing an atomic spy shortly after the end of the Second World War, an event occurred which would allegedly mark the beginning of the Cold War. It is the subject of a new book by David Tremain. David joins me live on the line now. David, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great stuff. Explain to me. Good morning. Explain to me a little bit then about your background and why you are so eminently qualified to write this book.
Well, my background actually was in paper conservation, restoring paper artifacts when I worked in England and also here in Canada. And I think by writing this book, I was able to translate the sort of analytical skills that I learned as a conservator to sort of analyze what was going on in this story and other stories like that. I've spent a lot of time reading spy books over the last, about 5 decades. And you sort of build up a feel and an interest for these things.
So set the scene if you can then. Explain a little bit about what situation is. The Second World War is over and the Cold... I mean, is this one of the events that, in your opinion, gets the Cold War, turns the Cold War cold, as it were?
Well, a lot of people would say that it started, this event started the Cold War, but I'm kind of inclined to believe that the Cold War actually started a lot earlier than that. Probably after the Russian Revolution, probably during the Russian Civil War, which was in the early 20s. And then over time, the Cold War sort of stopped and started. There was a pause in the 20s, and it wasn't until really the 1941, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that Russia became an ally. Before that, they were spying on Britain and consequently Canada. And then, with the fall of the Cold War and so on, the Berlin Wall and so on, the Cold War ended. But then now with Putin, the Cold War sort of picked up again. So it's been on and off, probably, I would say, almost over the last 100 years.
So what's the situation then with this particular this young cipher clerk and what is the GRU? Is it the GRU?
The GRU, yeah, it's now just called the GU, but back then it was called the GRU. I can't even pronounce what it is in Russian, but I'm not even going to try. That was Soviet military intelligence as opposed to what most people are familiar with as the KGB, although back then it was the NKVD. It morphed into a whole load of different acronyms. So they were handling the sort of military intelligence side of things.
And so he decides he's had enough of life in the Soviet Union. Explain to me about how he sort of physically gets over to the West and what does he bring with him?
Well, he was posted to Ottawa. Originally, he was intended to be posted to Beijing. But because he was married, the Chinese wouldn't allow spouses to go with them. So they sent him to Ottawa instead. And that was in 1943. But it wasn't until 1945 that he decided to defect. Part of the reason was that he got used to a more free lifestyle in Canada than he'd been used to in Russia. But over the course of his work, he was discovering all sorts of messages that were coming through. He was handling all these secret messages, and it was revealing a spy network that was operating in Canada at the time. And to quote what he had written, it was something that the world needed to know. Mm. And so he decided he was going to stuff all these documents. There's about 107 or 109, depending on who you read, documents down his trousers and in his shirt and so on, and walked out of the building with these and tried to convince the Canadian authorities that this was important, that they needed to know this. But initially, nobody really wanted to know. They just sent him away as a crank.
I mean, one of the things that interested me is the Canadian Prime Minister. Is it Mackenzie King? And he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to touch this because he's very worried that it might actually reheat the Cold War into a hot war.
Yeah, he was afraid that was going to happen. The guy Mackenzie King was known to be kind of eccentric. I mean, he used to have seances and talk to his dead mother and ask his dog for advice.
Okay, sounds reasonable to me, but there you go.
But the common sort of mythology is that he was a bit of a Looney Tunes, I suppose. But there was a meeting coming up between the major powers to decide what was going to happen after the Second World War, and he thought that if he was going to be meeting with these people, that Stalin might get upset about it and decide to overreact and start the Third World War. Except by that point, they didn't really have a nuclear weapon.
So at this point, I mean, he reveals that there's this spy network, this British Canadian spy network, and that throws that poses some real problems because this is obviously post America at this point is the only atomic power. And this makes it very, very sort of difficult. And there's a high percentage of Americans who are very suspicious about Europeans and the British and thinking they're all sort of, socialists and communists. And so it really does throw the sort of, if you like, the collywobbles into the relationship between Canada, the US and the UK.
Yeah. I think the Russians were already, developing a nuclear weapon. Because obviously their scientists were probably just as equally qualified as British and American ones. But what happened was, because of the information that they received and also the samples of uranium which Alan Nunn May gave them and was smuggled out of Canada back to Russia, it advanced their capability of producing a nuclear weapon maybe a few years before it was expected. Some people have sort of said, it advanced it quite a number of years, but others have sort of said, only put them ahead a year or so.
So what was the reaction then? I mean, what kind of happened next then? I mean, this grew. This Igor Gozenko has revealed that there's, with the main figure is going to be is this Alan Nunn May. I mean, what kind of happens next? Does Gozenko go to the papers? Does Alan Nunn May, bolt to Moscow? I mean, what is the? I mean, I know the book's called Fallout, but what is the fallout from these initial revelations, and where did they go?
Well, the British were receiving intelligence from via New York, British Security Coordination, and some of these telegrams that were being sent by Sir William Stevenson revealed the presence of Nunn May as somebody that was involved in this spy network. I mean, later there were others that were discovered, like Klaus Fuchs and Bruno Pontecorvo, but at that point they didn't know about them. It wasn't until February 1946 that they actually acted to question Nunn May, because by that point he'd come back from Canada to London and resume work at King's College London. So it was sort of mid-February that this was supposed to happen. Also, he was supposedly going to meet a Russian contact in London outside the Museum Tavern, which is just opposite the British Museum. But that never happened. One of the reasons for that, the one that appears to be the reason, is that unbeknownst to British intelligence, Kim Philby, who most people have probably heard about, was passing on this information to his Russian contacts and actually delaying any information that was being passed to MI5 and MI6 until maybe a couple of days later. Because what was happening was that one of the members of the spy network worked at the British High Commission in Ottawa, and so it was felt that communications between them were compromised, and so the need was to send everything via New York to London, and the main point of contact was Kim Philby. So he was a sort of a spanner in the works at the time. But it wasn't until maybe a month or so later that the Brits decided they got a case against Nunn May and were going to arrest him and charge him with espionage under the Official Secrets Act.
What happens with with Igor Gouzenko himself? Because presumably he can't be wandering around in Canada because the Soviets find out that he's defected. He would to use Stalinist parlance, he'd be liquidated quite quickly, I'd imagine.
Yeah. Well, what happened initially was he'd gone to the newspapers to try to tell them about what was happening. He'd gone to the Department of Justice. At that point, he didn't really trust the RCMP because of the Mounties, because they were a police force and people living in Russia were suspicious of anybody like that. And even on the night that he got back on the 5th of September, when he got back to his apartment, there were Russians camping out basically outside the building, and he was having to hide. He and his wife had to hide in another apartment in the building. What happened was that a day or so later, the RCMP took him to their barracks in Rockcliffe in Ottawa, hid him there, and questioned him, and then later on sort of spirited him away to what was then called Camp X on Lake Ontario, which had been a training camp for secret agents during the Second World War. And then eventually he went to other sort of safe houses and so on. And the whole family was put into witness protection. And basically they sort of stayed in that sort of configuration for forever after.
Right.
The brothers, or his sons rather, have never spoken about it. It's only been his oldest daughter that has ever really spoken publicly about it. And even when Gouzenko was being interviewed by CBC and so on, he always appeared with a pillowcase over his head. A lot of people say that was because he wanted to hide his identity from the Russians, but I mean, the Russians knew what he looked like.
Yeah.
More. His daughter says it was because he wanted to sort of protect his family. But that's a sort of common image that everybody's familiar with.
Yeah. An interesting thing as well is the fact of, with Nunn May, because he goes to prison for it. He gets out and obviously works a bit hard to come by. But you look at his life, and, this is time of the Cambridge Five, who we know, and you say Philby and as Blunton, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah. He's not as perhaps as well known as people would say, Burgess, Philby, et cetera. But, he's he believes that what he did was the right thing, and he still believes that. And when he comes out, he's not like, I've done a terrible thing. He's of that type that goes, no, I was passing these on because of danger to humanity, because of his belief in the Socialist Republic of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that was his sort of belief. He was very unrepentant, and even when MI5 went to the various prisons that he was in to interview him and try to find out exactly what he had revealed, he just refused to talk about it. He believed that, this was something that humanity needed to know about. It should be shared with everybody, not just the British, the Americans, the Canadians, and so on. He believed that everybody needed to know about this. I suppose one could get into a big discussion about that in today's context. But yeah, as you pointed out, he had difficulty getting employment afterwards. Nobody really trusted him. But it was a former friend of his that got him a job working in a small company in Cambridge making analytical equipment.
What are you hoping that people are going to learn from the book Fallout? Are there any lessons that we should learn? Is it a historical document? I mean, what do you hope that people will learn from Fallout?
Good question. I'm hoping that people will learn, this particular aspect of history, which a lot of people don't know about. I'm sure most people in Britain and Europe have probably never heard of Gouzenko. There's a lot of Canadians that haven't either, for that matter. I think there's this sort of moral thing about, scientists feel that they're sort of universal, that everybody, chemistry or physics is universal knowledge. But in fact, there are things that really perhaps shouldn't be shared because they can be exploited in the wrong way. I don't know.
They should. Listeners, you can order the book via our own virtual bookstore and find out a little bit more. The book is called Fallout. It's by one of the many by David Tremain, who we're speaking to today. So go forth and go to the bookstore and buy it. What are you up to next, David? What's your next subject? Because you've done this sort of thing before.
Yeah, this was my 8th book. I've been working on a sequel to it, or a companion volume, because I wasn't able to cover much about the other members of the Spy Network. So this one is actually, if you like, sort of mini bios of the other members of the network. I've just actually been negotiating a contract with a new publisher for that. So I think that's probably going to come out probably next year. I've got to make some major changes to it because I've got far too much information in it at the moment. And it's an author's problem that we always write too much. And then have to sort of chop it down afterwards.
always leave the best bits on the editor's floor. Yeah, I know that.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same with movies and TV shows and all this sort of thing. Probably radio shows as well.
Yes, this show's going to be probably cut down to a 5-second highlight reel. But there you go. The book is called Fallout: An Exposing an Atomic Spy. It's by the great David Tremain. David, do you have a website? Can people go to you and find you online?
I don't, unfortunately. I've never got round to doing one. I'm not.
With 8 books, David, come on, you should really have a social media presence at the very least.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, so people can find me on there, and my email information is on there. Anybody that has contacted me has usually done it through my publisher, which is kind of interesting because I usually end up finding little snippets of information which I wish I'd known about at the time when I was writing whatever book it was. Somebody sort of contacts me and says, "Oh yeah, I used to know so and so, or we used to go, walking the dog together or something."
And he told me, and you're like, "Oh no, exactly." Great.
Why didn't I know that at the time?
Great stuff. This book is called Fallout: Exposing an Atomic Spy. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore. It's by David Tremain. David, thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you. Good job.